The empire that could not slow down. Power rarely looks fragile while it still commands obedience. It looks strongest in the very years when its ability to respond begins to slow. In the final decades of British rule in India, the machinery of empire never stopped moving. Offices still opened, orders still issued, courts still sat. But underneath that motion, something had changed. The distance between decision and consequence had grown too wide to close quickly. This is the story of an authority that mastered scale and was slowly buried beneath it. By the early 20th century, the British Raj governed a subcontinent of hundreds of millions through a bureaucracy designed for a fraction of that number. The Indian civil service, prestigious and rigorously trained, numbered only in the low thousands, spread across provinces the size of European nations. Viceroys in Calcutta and later Delhi issued policy meant to apply uniformly from the Himalayan frontier to the Malabar coast. Railways, telegraph lines, and a professionalized administration had once been the empire's proudest instruments of control. Visible proof that distance could be conquered by organization. Legislative councils met. Land revenue was assessed. Famine codes existed on paper, refined after past disasters, ready in theory to be activated at the first sign of failure. Authority still functioned. Every lever remained in place. But every lever now had to travel further, through more hands, before it produced an effect. The pattern begins here, not in defiance, but in distance. A directive drafted in Delhi required weeks to reach a district officer in the central provinces, and weeks more before its consequences could be verified. Administrators prized uniform procedure because procedure was what allowed a small number of British officials to govern a vast number of Indian subjects. But uniformity punished improvisation. A district officer who deviated from standard practice, even to respond faster to local conditions, risked censure from a hierarchy that valued consistency over speed. So, officers waited for instruction, and instruction waited on assessment, and assessment waited on reports that had themselves traveled slowly to be written. Regional administrators delayed relief measures during shortages, while cultivators watched grain prices shift without knowing whether official intervention would arrive in time to matter. This was not incompetence. It was a system operating exactly as designed. A design built for control, not velocity. The Raj had scaled its authority successfully outward. It had never scaled its capacity to listen inward at the same pace. By the interwar years, the pressures multiplied. Nationalist politics, organized and increasingly disciplined, forced the administration into a posture of near-constant calculation. Concessions had to be weighed against the risk of appearing weak. Repression had to be weighed against the risk of provoking wider unrest. Every choice now carried two audiences: the colonized population watching for signs of retreat, and the imperial government in London watching for signs of loss of control. The Government of India Act of 1935 attempted to answer this by devolving certain powers to provincial legislatures, a gesture toward participation, but devolution created its own friction. Authority divided between provincial ministries and the colonial center meant that responses, which once required one signature, now required negotiation between institutions that did not always agree on urgency or even on facts. Meanwhile, the apparatus of order, police, courts, the machinery of detention, expanded in response to unrest. But expansion is not the same as agility. More officers meant more reporting layers. More laws meant more procedural steps before action could be taken. The empire kept adding weight to a structure already straining to move quickly, mistaking accumulation for strength. Junior officials in provincial towns enforced ordinances they had not fully been briefed on, adjusting daily to instructions that sometimes contradicted the week before. Then came the pressures no administrative structure, however refined, could fully absorb. The Second World War transformed India from a colony to be governed into a base to be mobilized. Troops, grain, industry, all extracted at a pace the civil administration had never been asked to sustain. Procurement targets set in London and relayed through provincial governments collided with local scarcity in ways that took months to register at the top of the hierarchy. When the Bengal famine unfolded in 1943, the machinery built to detect and respond to exactly this kind of catastrophe existed. The famine codes had not vanished, but the layers between observation and authorization to act had grown so dense that recognition itself arrived too late to prevent the worst of it. This was not a failure of care alone. It was a structural failure of speed, built up over decades of governing by delay rather than governing by proximity. The war years also exposed how narrow the space for administrative maneuver had become. Every request for greater provincial autonomy, every appeal for faster decision-making authority at the local level ran into the same constraint that had defined the Raj since its founding. Control depended on centralization, and centralization depended on slowness as its price of stability. To loosen the hierarchy risked losing the very uniformity that legitimized British rule as a coherent, singular government, rather than a patchwork of competing local powers. And so the hierarchy held, even as it groaned under its own weight. By 1945, the administration that had once prided itself on order found itself managing crises it could name, but could no longer move fast enough to contain political unrest that shifted week to week, economic dislocation from wartime extraction, and a nationalist movement that had learned to exploit exactly the gap between announcement and action that bureaucratic caution had built. Meetings were still held. Files still moved through offices. Authority had not disappeared. But it had narrowed into something closer to management of appearances than command of events. Provincial clerks processed transfer orders and requisition forms without knowing which of them would still carry weight by the time they were carried out. The Raj in these final years never stopped functioning. Salaries were paid. Trains ran. Judges issued rulings. That is precisely what made the strain so difficult to see from within the system itself. Everything that could be measured still worked. What had eroded was something harder to quantify: the interval between a problem's appearance and an authority's ability to answer it. An empire built to project control across enormous distance had succeeded so completely at extending its reach that it forgot to preserve its reflexes. Authority often appears strongest just before its choices begin to narrow. If this exploration stayed with you, you'll find more on timeless questions.